For well over a century, across thousands of Southern kitchens, the same humble pan of cornbread fed families who had almost nothing else on the table. It was survival bread, plain and cheap, stretched to make a thin meal feel like plenty. But the women who baked it knew things our recipe cards never wrote down. Number 19 on this list is why they slid the greased skillet into the fire until it screamed, so the batter hissed and the crust cracked like glass. Number 13 explains the rule they never broke about sugar. And number 4 on this list shows how a kettle of boiling water turned dry meal into something golden. The genius was never the cornmeal, it was the hands and the timing. So hit subscribe and let's pull up to the table, because here are 20 genius cornbread tricks only Southern Black grandmothers knew. Number 20, reaching for white stone ground meal. The choice was made long before the bowl ever came down off the shelf. Southern cooks did not grab the bright yellow, fine as dust meal sold in paper sacks today. They wanted white cornmeal, ground slow between stones, with the grit and the germ still in it. That coarse texture is what gave their cornbread its backbone, a little tooth in every bite instead of a soft cake crumb. The stone grinding kept the corn oil in the meal, so the bread tasted nutty and full even when there was nothing else on the plate. Yellow meal was fine for the hogs, the old saying went, but the table got white. Fresh ground meal also went rancid faster, which is why a good cook bought it in small amounts and used it quick. The lesson they carried was simple. The bread is only as good as the meal you start with, and the meal had to be real corn, not powder. Choose stone ground meal, and you're halfway to honest cornbread. Number 19, screaming the skillet hot before the batter goes in. This is the one trick that separated their cornbread from everyone else's, and it started with patience. The greased iron pan went into the oven empty, or sat over the open flame until it was almost smoking. Cooks listened for it, and they watched it, looking for the first thin wisp of smoke off the grease. When a drop of batter hit that surface and hissed like water on a stove lid, the pan was ready, and not 1 second before. Only then did the rest of the batter go in, and the whole bowl would crackle and spit the moment it touched the metal. That violent first contact set the crust instantly before the inside ever began to cook. The bottom seared and sealed itself in the time it took to set the bowl down. The result was an edge so crisp it cracked like glass when you cut it, golden brown all the way around, while the middle stayed tender and steamed soft. A cold pan gave you pale, greasy bread that stuck and stewed in its own moisture instead of searing. The hot pan gave you that lacquered bottom every Sunday plate fought over, the peace children begged for. It took no extra money, only the patience to wait out the heat. Heat the iron until it scares you, then pour. Number 18, mixing the batter with buttermilk, never sweet milk. Plain milk made a flat, dull bread, and these cooks knew it. They reached for buttermilk, thick and sour, left over from churning or simply turned on the back of the counter. That tang did 2 jobs at once. It seasoned the bread with a faint sharpness that played against the sweet corn, and its acid woke up the leavening so the crumb rose light instead of dense. The sourness also tenderized the meal, softening the grit and leaving the crumb fine. Buttermilk kept the inside moist as well, which mattered when the bread had to stretch across a long table and still taste good cold the next morning. In poorer kitchens, when the cow's milk had gone past fresh and turned thick, that was no waste at all. Soured milk was exactly what the recipe wanted, and the more it had clabbered, the better the bread. Nothing on a southern farm got thrown out if it could feed somebody first, and a turned jug of milk was simply tomorrow's cornbread waiting. A cook who understood buttermilk understood that sour was not spoiled, it was flavor and lift waiting to be used. Sweet milk made a pale, lazy loaf by comparison. Pour in the buttermilk and the bread will thank you. Number 17, the cast iron skillet itself. No tool in the southern kitchen carried more weight, and not just the literal kind. For most families, through most of these years, the heavy black pan was not one choice among many. It was the only pan there was. Everything came out of it: the cornbread and the fried chicken, the beans, the gravy, the eggs at dawn. It was bought once and meant to last a lifetime, and it usually outlasted the cook. A good skillet was never scrubbed down to bare metal. The thin layer of cooked-in fat, the seasoning, was guarded like money, because it was money in a way. That black sheen meant the bread released clean and the crust browned even, with no flour and no fuss. When a pan was passed from a mother to a daughter, it came already seasoned by years of cornbread and pork fat, carrying the memory of every meal cooked before. That was the real inheritance, more than any china. The deeper history sits in the iron too. Many of these pans came up through plantation kitchens, where enslaved black women fed everyone and cooked over open hearths with whatever they were given, turning the cheapest meal into something that tasted like care. The skill of reading a hot pan by sound and smell, of knowing the exact moment to pour, was learned hard and handed down on purpose, one of the few things that could be kept and passed along when so much else was taken. So the skillet was never just a skillet, it was a record of who taught whom, a tool that held heat and held history at the same time. A grandmother's pan was her signature, and the cornbread it made was proof the lesson had been received. Treat the iron with respect and it will outlast you too. Number 16, pouring the batter into hot fat for the sizzle ring. There is a sound a good cook waits for, and this trick is built around it. Before the batter ever went in, a spoonful of lard or bacon grease was dropped into the already screaming pan and swirled until it shimmered and nearly smoked. The grease had to be hot enough to ripple, almost ready to burn. When the batter hit that pool of fat, it sizzled around the rim and climbed the sides, frying the outer edge while the center baked. That gave the loaf a crisp lacquered ring all the way around, the part everybody fought over at the table. The fat also greased the pan so the bread lifted out whole, never tearing or sticking to the iron. Skip this step and the batter just sat there, soaking instead of searing, and the edges came out soft and pale. The hot fat pour was the difference between plain cornbread and the kind people remembered. It cost almost nothing, just a spoon of grease and a little nerve to let the pan get that hot. Drop the fat in first and listen for the sizzle before you pour. Number 15, letting baking soda and buttermilk do the lifting. Old cooks did not trust a tall stack of leavening, and they did not need it. A pinch of soda stirred into the meal, then met with sour buttermilk, set off a quiet chemical rise the moment the two touched. The acid in the buttermilk and the soda fizzed against each other, lifting the crumb just enough to keep it tender without turning it into spongy cake. That is why the batter went into the hot pan fast, before the bubbles could fade and flatten. Wait too long and the rise was gone, leaving a dense, heavy bread that sat in your stomach like a stone. Some hands used a little baking powder too, but the buttermilk and soda pairing was the older way, learned back when store leavening was dear, and a careful cook stretched every spoonful she had. It also balanced the sour, since the soda took the sharp edge off the tang and left the clean corn flavor behind. The whole reaction cost a pinch of powder and a moment's attention. Stir the soda into the meal, then move quick. Number 14, stirring a spoon of bacon drippings into the batter. The grease jar by the stove was not waste, it was seasoning, and a smart cook borrowed from it twice. Besides the fat that went in the pan, a spoonful of warm bacon drippings got stirred right into the batter itself. That carried the smoke and salt of the pork all the way through the bread, so every crumb tasted of the kitchen, not just the crust. It also kept the inside rich and moist, standing in for the butter and oil that money could not always buy. The drippings tin lived right beside the stove, filled a little more after every breakfast, and it was treasure in a poor kitchen. Nothing on that farm went to waste, and the grease saved from morning paid off again at supper. The fat coated the cornmeal, too, which kept the bread from drying out hard and crumbly the next day. A bread made this way needed no butter at all, though it surely got it anyway when there was some to spare. It is a small habit that turned a thin bread into a filling one. Spoon the warm drippings into the batter, and the whole loaf carries the flavor. Number 13, never adding sugar. This was the rule they never broke, and it was almost a point of pride. Real Southern cornbread had no sugar in it. Not a spoonful, not a pinch. To these cooks, sugar turned bread into cake, and cake had no business sitting next to a pot of greens or a bowl of beans. Cornbread was meant to be a savory thing, a vessel for soaking up potlikker and gravy, and sweetness only got in the way of that job. The corn itself carried all the gentle sweetness the bread ever needed, especially good stone ground meal that still had its oil. Sweet cornbread was sometimes called Yankee cornbread, said with a small frown, because the sugar marked it as somebody else's recipe from somewhere up north. There was also plain sense in the rule. Sugar was expensive and was saved for the cobblers and the cakes that earned the splurge on a special day. Wasting it on the everyday bread that came to the table 3 times a week made no sense in a careful kitchen. So the bread stayed honest, browning deep and tasting of corn and fat and a little salt, exactly the way it was meant to taste beside greens and beans. A cook who slipped in sugar gave herself away. Leave the sugar in the bowl where it belongs. Number 12, resting the batter so the meal drinks the liquid. Patience showed up again here in a step most modern cooks skip. After the batter was mixed, a good cook let it sit a few minutes while the pan came up to heat. That rest gave the coarse cornmeal time to drink in the buttermilk and soften instead of staying gritty and dry in the middle of the bread. The grains swelled and the batter thickened, which made for a crumb that held together tender rather than crumbling apart on the plate. With stone ground meal especially, that soaking time mattered, since the rough grind needed a minute to relax and take on the liquid. The weight also let the leavening get going, so the batter went in already lively. Cooks judged it by feel, knowing the batter was ready when it had thickened just enough to mound softly on a spoon. Rushing the bowl into a cold pan undid all of it, leaving a gritty, fallen bread. 2 old steps, a screaming pan, and a rested batter worked hand in hand toward the same loaf. Let the meal sit and drink before it ever seized the iron. Number 11, folding pork cracklings into crackling bread. When there was pork to spare, plain cornbread got a glorious upgrade. After lard was rendered down, the crisp little bits of fried fat and skin left behind were called cracklings, and a cook folded a generous handful of them right into the batter. They baked up into crunchy, salty, smoky nuggets all through the bread, turning a humble loaf into something close to a feast. Crackling bread has a long and heavy history behind it. It was eaten in the cabins of enslaved people, made from the scraps and renderings left after the better cuts of the hog were taken away to the big house, and black cooks learned to coax real richness out of even those leftovers. The cracklings themselves came from the hog killing, when the men rendered the fat down in a great black wash pot, and the crisp bits left behind were divided among everyone who helped with the day's hard work. Out of that hardship came a bread so good It outlived the cruelty that shaped it, and it still shows up proudly at our Southern tables today, in cookbooks and at church suppers alike. Nothing on a hog was ever wasted, not the fat, not the skin, not a scrap, and crackling bread proved it better than anything. The crunch of pork worked through warm cornbread was a small, hard-earned luxury pulled from what others threw out. Save your cracklings and fold them in for the richest bread of all. Number 10, shaping corn pone by hand with just meal, water, and soap. When the larder was nearly bare, this was the bread that still got made. There was no buttermilk, no egg, no leavening, only stone ground meal, a little salt, and enough hot water to bring it together into a stiff dough. A cook scooped up a handful, patted it into a small oval right in her palm, and pressed her fingerprints into the top before it ever met the heat. That hand shaping is where the name comes from, since pone traces back to an Indian word the native peoples of the Southeast use for their baked corn cakes. The word can be traced to the Powhatan term apon, meaning something baked, recorded by English colonists in Virginia as early as 1612, when they ate the bread the Powhatan people called ponap. The dough went into a greased pan or straight onto the hot hearth, and it baked up dense, chewy, and honest, made to be broken apart and dipped in Potlikker. Pone fed enslaved families and poor farmers alike because it asked for almost nothing and filled a working body all morning. It is the oldest cornbread there is, the recipe stripped down to corn and fire. When the cupboard was empty, hands and meal and water was still enough. Number 9, frying hoe cakes thin on a flat griddle. Not every cornbread came out of a deep pan, and the flattest one carried the heaviest history. A thin batter of meal, salt, and water was spooned onto a hot greased griddle and fried like a pancake, crisp at the lacy edges and tender in the middle, flipped once and eaten hot off the iron. The name tells you where it began. Enslaved field hands cooked these cakes on the blade of a garden hoe held over the coals, because a hoe was the only flat metal surface they were given out in the fields. That story of cooking supper on a farming tool has carried down through generations as a mark of endurance and plain ingenuity under cruelty. The cakes drew on griddle traditions enslaved Africans carried with them, breads made from ground millet and sorghum back home that adapted easily once cornmeal became the grain most within reach in the American South. A hoe cake needed no oven and no waiting, which made it the perfect bread for people who had neither time nor tools to spare. It cooked in minutes, stretched a fistful of meal into a meal, and tasted of corn and hot grease and nothing else. Heat the griddle, spoon it thin, and flip when the edges go lace. Number 8, folding beaten egg whites into a custardy spoon bread. Here the same cornmeal turned into something almost like a souffle, soft enough to eat with a spoon. The cook scalded the meal with hot milk until it thickened like porridge, then folded in egg whites that had been whipped to stiff peaks, trapping air all through the batter. In the heat of the pan that trapped air, puffed the bread up tall and trembling, with a tender custard center and a faintly brown top. The trick of separating the eggs and beating the whites for lift was carried by enslaved African-American cooks trained in fine kitchens who took a French method and made it their own. One of the cooks credited with that souffle technique was James Hemings, enslaved by Thomas Jefferson and schooled in French method, whose hands joined a native grain to a borrowed skill. Spoon bread itself reaches back further still, to the corn dishes of the native peoples of the Carolina Lowcountry. It was the cornbread for a Sunday table or a guest, richer and gentler than the everyday pan, the kind that announced somebody had taken extra time and care, Beat the whites stiff, fold them gentle, and the bread rises like a cloud. Number 7, binding the batter with one good beaten egg. A single egg did quiet, important work, and a careful cook never wasted it. Beaten into the buttermilk before the meal went in, that one egg bound the crumb so a slice held its shape on the plate instead of falling to dust under the knife. The egg added richness too, a faint golden tenderness that plain meal and water could never reach on their own. It helped the bread brown deeper on top and lifted the texture just enough to keep it from baking down into a heavy brick. The protein in the egg sets as it bakes, building a gentle frame around the corn so the crumb has something to cling to instead of falling loose the moment a knife touches it. In a kitchen where eggs came from the hens out back and were counted carefully, spending one on the daily bread was a small choice that paid off in every bite. When the hens were laying well, the cornbread got an egg and turned out fine-grained and proud. One egg was the difference between bread that crumbled and bread that sliced clean. Number 6, mixing fine and coarse cornmeal for texture. The finest cooks did not trust a single grind to do the whole job. They blended 2 meals in the bowl, a fine, soft grind for a tender crumb and a coarse, gritty grind for backbone and crunch. The fine meal drank up the buttermilk and bound everything smooth, while the coarse meal kept its tooth even after baking, scattering little pockets of crisp grit through every slice. That mix gave the bread 2 textures at once, soft and substantial in the same bite, instead of the dull sameness of one grind alone. It came naturally from stone milling, where the same batch of corn produced both fine flour and rough grit, and a thrifty cook simply used all of it rather than sifting any away. Because stone grinding kept the whole kernel, oil, germ, and bran together, that mix of grinds also carried more corn flavor than the powdery, degerminated meal sold in sacks later on. Nothing got thrown out, and the bread was better for it. The coarse grains also held moisture and gave the crumb something to lean on, so the loaf stayed sturdy enough to soak up gravy without going to mush. Blend the fine and the coarse, and the bread eats like 2 breads in one. Number 5, reading doneness by the hollow thump. There were no timers ticking on these counters, and no little glass windows in the oven door. A cook knew her bread was done by sound and by sight, the way her own grandmother had taught her. She watched for the top to go deep golden and pulled just slightly away from the sides of the pan, and the smell to turn from raw and starchy to toasted and sweet. Then came the test that settled it. She tapped the crust with the knuckle or the back of a spoon and listened. A wet, dull thud meant the middle was still batter and needed more time. A clean, hollow knock, like rapping on a door, meant the moisture inside had baked off and the crumb was set all the way through. The sound itself comes from the steam having cooked away, leaving small air pockets that ring instead of thud, the same dense water giving back a flat, dull note when the center is still wet. That hollow sound has guided bread bakers for generations, long before anyone owned a thermometer, passed hand to hand as plain kitchen scents. Pull it too soon, and the center sank wet and gummy. Trust your ear over the clock, and the bread comes out right. Number 4, scalding dry meal with boiling water for hot water cornbread. This is the trick promised at the start, and it is maybe the oldest one of all. A kettle was brought to a hard boil, and the bubbling water was poured straight over a bowl of dry cornmeal and salt, stirring fast as it went. The heat cooked the meal on contact, softening the grit and swelling the starch into a thick, sticky dough that pulled together in seconds. The boiling water turns some of the cornstarch into sugar, which is why these little cakes brown so deep and taste faintly sweet with none added. The cook wet her hands, patted that hot dough into small flat patties, and slid them into a skillet of hot grease to fry until they were deep golden and crisp on both sides. The result was crunchy outside, soft and almost creamy within, eaten hot with greens or beans. The method runs straight back to the cooking of the native peoples of this land and the enslaved Africans who recognized cornmeal as a cousin to the grains of home and made bread from water, meal, and salt when there was nothing else to be had. It survived the Depression for the same reason it was born, because it cost almost nothing and filled an empty stomach. Pour the boiling water over the meal, and the simplest cornbread there is comes to life. Number 3, saving stale cornbread for the holiday dressing. A good cook never looked at day-old bread and saw garbage. She saw next week's dressing. The leftover pan went uncovered on the counter to dry out hard, or got crumbled and spread on a sheet to go stale on purpose, because fresh, moist cornbread would only turn to paste once the broth hit it. Dried and crumbled, it drank up the turkey stock, the sage, the onion and celery, and beaten egg, and held its shape into a savory golden dressing that anchored every holiday table. That dish was the crown of Thanksgiving and Christmas in Southern black kitchens, a recipe guarded and argued over and handed down like an heirloom. Its roots run back to a dish enslaved cooks called kush, crumbled leftover cornbread, stretched with onion and herbs from the garden, a way to make a thin ration go further that grew over time into the holiday dressing we still prize today. The everyday bread gone stale became the centerpiece of the year's biggest meal. It was the thrift of the kitchen turned into a celebration. Scarcity remembered even in plenty. Nothing was ever wasted, least of all good cornbread. Let it go stale on purpose, and the humble pan becomes the holiday's finest dish. Number 2, crumbling cornbread into a glass of cold buttermilk. The last meal of a long day was often the simplest and the most beloved. A wedge of leftover cornbread got broken into a tall glass or a deep bowl, cold buttermilk poured over the top, and the whole thing eaten with a spoon like a soft, tangy porridge. Folks called it Crumble-in, and it stretched from the hills of Appalachia all the way down into Texas. It was supper when there was nothing left to cook, a way to turn a stale heel of bread and a little soured milk into something filling and good. Field hands and farmers ate it after dark when they were too tired to fire the stove again, and children grew up on it as a bedtime treat. It leaned on buttermilk for good reason, since before refrigeration, the soured milk kept far longer than sweet milk, so a family with a cow and a pan of cornbread always had the makings of supper on hand. The sour buttermilk softened the crumb and cut the richness, and a little salt or black pepper finished it off. It used up the two things a poor kitchen almost always had: leftover cornbread and milk gone thick and wasted neither. Crumble the bread, pour the buttermilk cold, and supper is done. Number 1, brushing the hot crust with butter and salting bolder than you think. The very last touch came the moment the bread left the heat. While the loaf was still blistering hot in the pan, a cook ran a knob of butter across the top so it melted into the crust and soaked down into every crack, sealing in a soft shine and a richness the meal alone could never give. Just as important was the salt, and the old hands always used a good pinch of salt more than seemed right. Corn is mild and forgiving, and bread that tasted flat had simply been undersalted in the bowl, so a careful cook learned to season with a bolder hand than caution would suggest. There was thrift in the gesture too, since salt was once dear enough to be rationed and butter scarce, so finishing the crust this way turned the day's small luxuries into the part of supper everyone remembered. The two finishing moves worked together. The salt woke up the corn flavor from the inside, and the warm butter gilded the outside, turning plain survival bread into something nobody could stop eating. Butter the hot crust and salt it brave, and the simplest bread tastes like more than it cost. Number 23, testing hot oil with the wooden spoon handle. Before a single piece of chicken hit the grease, Big Mama lowered the dry end of a wooden spoon straight down into the pot. If the wood sat there quiet, the oil was cold and the chicken would sit in it like a sponge. If a slow string of pearl bubbles climbed the handle, the oil was right around 350 degrees, the temperature every fried chicken recipe in the world will tell you to chase. If the bubbles came up fast and angry, she slid the pot off the eye and waited. No clip-on thermometer ever lived in her kitchen. The wood told the truth every time because moisture trapped in the grain reacted to the heat of the oil with predictable bubbling, and once you had seen it, you never forgot what right looked like. Her chicken came out the color of polished walnut, and the crust never went soggy on the plate. Number 24, knocking the cast iron skillet to test the heat before the lard ever went in. A Kentucky kitchen in 1958. The pan had been her mother's, then her aunt's, then hers. Big Mama would drum the iron rim with the back of her wooden spoon and listen for the change in pitch, a low, ringing tone that said the pan was ready. Cold iron answered dull. Hot iron answered like a bell. Once the bell rang, she dropped a pinch of cornmeal into the dry pan. If the meal danced and browned in 3 seconds, the chicken went in. If it didn't, she waited a beat longer. There wasn't a thermometer, an infrared gun, or an app. There was a woman, an iron pan, and 40 years of knowing. The fried chicken came out crackling. The skin shattered. The meat was juicy enough to drip down the wrist of the child who ate it, standing at the counter. Year after year, that same pan rang the same bell. Stewed tomatoes could turn sharp and sour if you let them, especially the ones canned at the end of summer when the fruit came in fast and acidic. The fix was a pinch of sugar, sometimes 2, stirred in while the pot was still bubbling. It did not make the tomatoes sweet. It rounded them out, pulled back that bite that sat on the back of your tongue. This trick showed up in spaghetti sauce, ladled over white rice, in tomato gravy, spooned across biscuits, in the base of any stew where canned tomatoes formed the backbone. She never explained why it worked. She just tapped the sugar bowl with a teaspoon, let a little fall in, stirred once, and tasted. If you asked, she might say the tomatoes were angry and needed calming down. That was all the science you were going to get. Number 20, stretching tough cuts of meat with buttermilk overnight. When the round steak was the cheap kind, the kind that could turn into shoe leather under the wrong hand, Big Mama reached for the buttermilk crock. She would lay the meat flat in a deep bowl, pour cold buttermilk over the top until the steak was fully covered, and slide the bowl into the icebox before she went to bed. The next morning, the same cut that would have fought a fork the night before was relaxed and pliable, ready to be breaded and pan-fried into chicken fried steak that you could cut with the edge of a butter knife. The trick is lactic acid. The mild acid in cultured buttermilk slowly breaks down tough muscle fibers without ever turning the surface mushy the way stronger acids will. Vinegar moves too fast, wine moves too sharp. Buttermilk moves the speed of grandmother time, slow and patient and gentle, which was exactly the right speed for cheap meat and a house full of mouths to feed by morning. Nothing else worked as well, and she always had a quart of buttermilk on hand for biscuits anyway. Number 23, rendering pork fat on a Sunday and pouring it into a coffee can for the rest of the week. A wood stove in Greenville, Mississippi, 1953. Your Big Mama cut 3 pounds of fat back into 1/2-inch cubes Drop them into a heavy pot with a quarter cup of water and let the whole thing simmer over a low flame for 2 hours. The water cooked off, the fat melted out clear as honey. The crackling sank to the bottom, golden and crisp, ready to be salted and snacked on by any grandchild who wandered through. The clear lard went through a square of cheesecloth into a Maxwell house can on the back of the stove. That can fed her family every supper for a week and the next and the next. The thing is, modern science didn't walk back its warnings on lard until around 2010. By then, she'd been cooking with it for 60 years and had never seen the inside of a cardiologist's office. Round steak cost next to nothing at the butcher counter because it was tough as shoe leather and nobody with money wanted it. But a woman with a box of Arm & Hammer and 40 minutes of patience could turn that slab into something that fell apart on the fork. A teaspoon of baking soda rubbed into the surface, left to sit for half an hour, then rinsed clean before seasoning. The alkaline powder raised the pH just enough to keep the proteins from seizing up tight during cooking, leaving the fibers loose and tender even over high heat. Nobody in those kitchens used the word pH. They just knew that a little soda and a little time could make a cheap cut taste like it came from a different animal. The same trick worked on stew meat cubed small and browned hot, turning what should have been chewy into something that melted into the gravy. That box of baking soda earned its place on the shelf 10 times over. Time equals 1 second. She never cooked anything the same day she seasoned it. The chicken got salted, peppered, dusted with garlic powder and paprika, maybe a little onion powder rubbed into every crevice, then covered with wax paper and left in the icebox overnight. By morning, the salt had pulled moisture to the surface and drawn it back in, carrying the seasoning deep into the flesh where heat alone could never push it. Pork chops got the same treatment. So did roasts. The trick was time, and time was the one ingredient that cost nothing. This was not brining, not marinating, not anything with the French name attached. It was just letting the meat sit with its seasoning long enough to become something better than it started. You could always tell the difference between chicken seasoned an hour before frying and chicken that spent the night with its spices. One was food, the other was a memory. Number 19, sharpening the kitchen knife on the rim of a plate. The kitchen drawer in Big Mama's house did not contain a sharpening stone because the underside of every dinner plate she owned was already won. When the paring knife started to drag through a tomato instead of slicing it, she would flip an everyday ceramic plate upside down on the counter, find the unglazed ring around the rim where the plate had rested on the kiln, and draw the blade across that bare ceramic at a low angle, 10 or 12 strokes per side. The unglazed clay is harder than carbon steel, hard enough to grind a true edge back onto a dull blade in under a minute. Every black grandmother in the South seemed to know this without ever being told. Some learned it from their own mothers. Some figured it out the first time their best knife went soft. But the move was so common across kitchens that food historians now treat it as a signature of mid-century African-American home cooking. The plate did double duty, and the knife went right back to work. Number 21, salting the meat the night before you cook. A Birmingham kitchen in 1955. Big Mama unwrapped a pork shoulder from the butcher paper and rubbed kosher salt deep into the fat cap with both hands. She covered it loose with a dish towel and slid it onto the cool side of the icebox. By morning, the salt had drawn the moisture to the surface, then pulled it back in along with every grain of seasoning. The meat cooked tender enough to fall off the bone with the back of a fork. Restaurant chefs would later call this a dry brine and write whole books about it. Big Mama called it leaving the meat alone overnight. She had learned the same trick from her own grandmother, who had learned it on a tobacco farm in 1898. The salt did the same work in every kitchen. The patience was the seasoning. If the sound of hot grease was the first lesson, the sink full of greens was the second. Nobody skipped the washing, and nobody washed them only once. Collards came in from the garden or the market with grit buried in every fold, tiny grains of sand that no amount of shaking could remove, and sometimes a caterpillar curled tight against the stem. The first wash was cold water and a splash of vinegar, leaves pulled apart and swirled until the water turned brown. Drain, fill again. Second wash, same thing. Slower now, each leaf turned over and inspected. Third wash, and if the water still showed dirt, a fourth. Some women soaked the greens in salt water for an hour before the washing even started. You never rushed it. A single grain of sand in a finished pot could ruin Sunday dinner, and the woman who served gritty greens would hear about it for years. That ritual at the sink was not cleaning. It was preparation, patience, and proof that you respected the people who were going to eat. Number 25, reading the foam on a pot of beans. Big Mama did not set a timer for pintos. She watched the foam. When a pot of dry beans first comes up to a boil, a thick gray crown rises to the top. Younger cooks today skim it off and worry. The older women in the kitchen knew what it meant. That foam is starch and saponin lifting out of the bean skins, and the way it behaves tells you the temperature of the pot. A loose, drifting foam means the beans are simmering right. A tight, packed foam climbing the side of the pot means the heat is too high and the skins will split before the centers turn creamy. Big Mama would lift the lid, look once, and slide the pot half off the burner without saying a word. By the time supper was on the table, every bean was tender to the tooth and not a single one had burst. The foam was the timer. Her eyes were the thermometer. Number 25, rinsing rice in cold water 3 times before it ever touches the pot. A blue speckled bowl on a porcelain sink in 1949 Charleston. Your Big Mama poured the long grain in, swirled it twice with her fingers, and tipped the cloudy water down the drain. She did it again, and then a third time until the water ran clear as a creek in March. What most people miss is that supermarket rice came dusted with talc and broken starch, the kind that'd turn a pot of clean white rice into glue by supper time. Edna Lewis wrote about this same trick in her notebooks from Freetown. The rice, once rinsed, sat in a cast iron pot with a pinch of salt and a tablespoon of bacon fat, simmered 18 minutes, and lifted off the spoon in single grains that held their shape under a ladle of Potlikker. Modern cooks call it gourmet technique. Your Big Mama called it Wednesday. Before nonstick coatings and ceramic pans lined every shelf, there was cast iron, heavy and black, and passed down like jewelry. The trick was never a single act of seasoning, but years of daily use, layer after layer of rendered fat bonding to the iron through heat and repetition, building a surface so slick that eggs slid across it like water on glass. Your grandmother never read about polymerized oil. She just knew. She knew you never put soap in that skillet, never let it sit in water, never handed it to someone who did not understand. After cooking, she wiped it clean with a rag, set it back on the burner to dry, then rubbed a thin coat of grease inside before putting it away. That pan held the memory of 10,000 meals, and every one of them made the next one better. When she died, the skillet was worth more than anything else in the kitchen, not for what it cost, but for what it carried. Whoever got that pan got her hands. Number 21, tenderizing tough greens with a splash of vinegar. The collards that came up out of the fall garden after the first frost was sweeter, but the leaves were leathery enough to resole a shoe. Big Mama dealt with them by tipping a small splash of apple cider vinegar into the simmering pot about an hour in, and then she let the greens go for another 60 to 90 minutes without lifting the lid more than twice. The mild acid in the vinegar breaks down the tough cellulose in mature greens, which is why the leaves end up silky instead of stringy. It also cuts the natural bitterness that lives in the stems. She never measured the splash. She knew the right amount by the smell that rose off the pot, somewhere between sharp and sweet, and she trusted the pot to tell her when the greens had given in. The Potlikker at the bottom was the prize, dark and savory, ready to be sopped up with a square of warm cornbread. Number 22, soaking dried beans overnight with a teaspoon of baking soda in the water. A Memphis kitchen in 1962. Big Mama dropped a pound of dried pintos into a chipped enamel bowl, covered them with cold water, and stirred in a single teaspoon of soda from the orange box on the shelf. The beans drank the water, the skins softened. The soda neutralized the gas compounds that had ruined a Sunday afternoon. By morning, the beans had doubled in size. She drained them, rinsed them once, and simmered them with a smoked ham hock and one chopped onion. The pot took 90 minutes instead of 4 hours. She saved gas, she saved time, she saved your granddaddy the embarrassment of a long car ride home from church. The trick traveled with her family from Tennessee to Detroit during the Great Migration, and her granddaughter was still doing it in a Cleveland apartment in 1991. Every black kitchen had one, and you knew exactly where it sat. The coffee can, sometimes a mason jar, sometimes an old Crisco tin, lived on the back of the stove or just beside it, always within reach. After every pan of bacon, every batch of fried pork chops, the grease got poured through a strainer or sometimes just a piece of cheesecloth draped over the rim. That rendered fat became the foundation of nearly everything, from eggs fried until the edges went lacy and crisp, to green beans simmered low with onion and a dollop of that golden fat stirred in at the start. During the Great Migration, families carried their grease cans north to Chicago and Detroit, and during the Second World War, the government actually asked households to save their cooking fat for the war effort, turning a kitchen habit into patriotic duty. She just called it Tuesday, and the woman who kept that can full was the one whose kitchen always smelled like something good was about to happen. Number 24, measuring salt in the cup of the pone. There were no spoons in her hand when the salt box came down off the shelf. Big Mama poured the salt into the soft hollow of her left palm, the one nearest the thumb, and gave it a half shake to settle the grains. A flat puddle was for greens. A small mound was for the bean pot. A heap that crowned over the edge of her hand was for a fresh batch of cornbread batter. She had learned the measure standing next to her own grandmother as a child, and her hand knew the right weight, the way a piano player's fingers know a chord. Food scientists today have measured the average cooking palm at right around 3/4 of a teaspoon. Big Mama had figured that out without ever opening a book. She salted by feel because feel never lied to her, and the cardboard box of Morton sat right there on the counter where her hand could find it in the dark. Number 20, dropping a clean copper penny into the greens pot to keep the color bright. A Sunday afternoon in Macon, Georgia, 1948. The collards had been picked from the garden that morning, the stems stripped, the leaves stacked and rolled and sliced into ribbons. Big Mama dropped them into the pot with a smoked turkey neck, a splash of cider vinegar, and a single Lincoln penny scrubbed bright with a slice of lemon. The greens cooked 2.5 hours. The copper held the green pigment in the leaves, so the pot came out emerald instead of army drab. She fished the penny out with a slotted spoon before serving and dropped it back into the cleaning jar by the sink. Modern cookbooks tell you to skip this trick because they're worried about leaching. Your big mama would tell you a clean penny and a clean pot for 2 hours never killed a soul, and the greens still tasted like Sunday. There was no thermometer clipped to the side of the pot, no digital readout blinking on the counter. She knew the oil was ready because she heard it, a flick of water from wet fingertips, a tiny crackle of flour pinched and dropped from above, or just the sound the grease made when it hit that precise shimmer, a low hiss shifting into a sharp, confident pop the moment something touched the surface. That sound meant 350 degrees, give or take, and she was never wrong. Kids learned to stay back when the popping started. They also learned to listen, because one day they would stand over that pot themselves. The women who fried fish on Friday nights could judge temperature by ear, the way a piano tuner judges pitch, and the chicken that came out of their oil was golden every single time. Nobody fries with that same ear anymore, because nobody stands close enough long enough to learn. Start to look closely, and one truth runs under all 20 tricks. The genius was never the cornmeal, which cost next to nothing. It lived in the hands that knew the moment to pour, the ears that read a hollow knock, the patience to let a pan grow hot enough to scare you. These women turned scarcity into something worth gathering around, and they taught the next pair of hands at the stove with no recipe written down. That knowing was carried forward on purpose, kept alive in skillets when so much else was taken. The bread was humble, the love behind it never was.